The 2022 F1 season has come to an end, and it was a strategy battle which went down to the wire for second in the championship. But it was the hat-trick of wins in Abu Dhabi for Max Verstappen that was the real story this evening, as he put the cherry on top of his most dominant season in Formula 1. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. A fascinating strategy battle. It was an interesting race in Abu Dhabi, as I believe the track changes made last year, combined with the new aerodynamic regulations, made the racing very interesting. So often we saw drivers making moves down the long back straight to overtake into turn 6, for the driver being overtaken to then get DRS themselves and make a move back into turn 9. It was a great section of track for overtaking, and yes, they were nearly all DRS assisted, but I think it made things more interesting than we've seen in these races over the last few seasons. The tyres chosen for this weekend also allowed for different race strategies, with the one-stop being an option and the two-stop also being a good option for the teams as well. All the top teams tried a one-stop with one of their drivers and a two-stop with the other, and that made the strategic battle between Perez and Leclerc very interesting indeed. The Ferrari team made the call to do the opposite of Perez, and with the Mexican driver diving into the pits to lock in the two-stop strategy, it meant the Red Bull would need to fight back past a few drivers if he wanted to achieve the 1-2 finish and the 1-2 in the World Championship. The tyres seemed to last longer than they'd anticipated though, and despite Perez taking 7 or 8 tenths out of the Ferrari per lap and catching up with the Monegasque driver on track, in the end it didn't quite materialise, and Perez was perhaps 1 or 2 laps away from getting past the Ferrari driver. It was a real race of what could have been, as I believe the drivers could have had a great on-track battle for that all-important second place in the championship. But personally, I think that this could have never even been a possibility just a few years ago with this circuit. So it's got to be a green box, as at least there was some interesting strategy calls in this race. The cherry on top for Verstappen's dominant season. With some of the drivers battling for position in the top teams, it was Verstappen that was the constant out at the front, and this weekend was no different. Verstappen put in 2 laps in qualifying that were good enough for pole position, and he then led throughout this Grand Prix. His performance looked comfortable at the front, and every time we see the Dutch driver, it didn't even look like he was pushing. And yet, he was still out there and taking time out of Charles Leclerc behind him. It was a race that shows just how dominant Verstappen has been this year. He's won 15 races of the 22, and particularly in the second half of the year, he's been untouchable, with the Ferraris simply unable to bring the fight to the Red Bulls. Today, Verstappen made the one-stop strategy work, and to be honest, I think he could have made any strategy work to take the top spot today. He's also very aware that next year is unlikely to be so dominant, with both Mercedes and Ferrari looking to bridge the gap to that top team. But even with stronger competition, it feels like Verstappen could be dominant once again. We really are in the Verstappen era of Formula 1. So for his performance today, I'm going to give Verstappen a purple box. The team might not have achieved the 1-2 finish that they wanted, but there was nothing more that Verstappen could have done today to help his team. And in the end, it was one of his strongest performances this season. Mercedes' tyre advantage failed to materialise. Mercedes took a step back compared to their last few races this weekend in Abu Dhabi, as they qualified on the third row of the grid rather than fighting for the front row like they were able to in Brazil and Mexico. But despite that result, there was optimism for Mercedes, as it was expected that they would have better tyre life than their rivals this weekend. In the opening stages, it looked like the Mercedes drivers could take the fight to Ferrari, as Hamilton was keeping up with Leclerc and was well in the mix with Carlos Sainz as well. Likewise, George Russell was up there as well, but in the end it wasn't to be for the Mercedes drivers, as all of a sudden their pace advantage disappeared after their tyres hit the cliff. It was as if they were driving completely different cars as the Ferrari started to pull away. The Mercedes drivers' races were hindered by different incidents, with the corner cut for Hamilton early on resulting in some reported floor damage, and then George Russell being released too soon at the first stops, hindering Lando Norris and getting a 5-second penalty in the process. Both incidents were avoidable and unfortunate for the team, as their unlikely challenge for second in the Constructors' Championship ultimately fell short, as they failed to be faster than Ferrari this weekend. To top it off, Hamilton's late hydraulic issue meant he was the victim of Mercedes' only mechanical issue this season, which is a staggering statistic in itself. But it came at the wrong time for Hamilton, as he failed to finish. To be honest, it didn't look like the team would have had enough to beat the Ferraris in the end, but the fact that they took it down to the wire is impressive enough based on where they were at the beginning of this year. So it's an amber box for Mercedes just because their hype didn't materialise this afternoon, but the amount of development that they've achieved this year is a huge achievement for the team as a whole. FIA inconsistencies continue. It wouldn't be the 2022 F1 season without a controversial FIA decision, and this time it came via an incident between Lewis Hamilton and Carlos Sainz on lap 1. Sainz saw an opportunity to dive down the inside of Hamilton into turn 6 as the Mercedes driver was trying to attack Charles Leclerc. Sainz took the inside line, leaving Hamilton to jump over the sausage curb and cutting turn 7, which meant he took the position back from the Spanish driver. It was a really similar incident to the one between Hamilton and Verstappen last year, where again, Hamilton cut the corner and then didn't seem to return the advantage. What followed this year though was a series of investigations that didn't really make a lot of sense. First, the FIA opened a query to determine if Sainz forced Hamilton off the circuit, and during this time, Hamilton had kept hold of that advantage on track. That initial investigation was then deemed not to be necessary, and so Sainz was essentially cleared of any wrongdoing, which then surely says that the British driver had left the track and gained a lasting advantage. Sure enough, another notice was sent out by the FIA to check whether the driver had left the track and gained an advantage, but after this time, Mercedes asked Hamilton to pass the position back to Carlos Sainz. Once again, the FIA sent a notice to say that no further action was required, which was another strange outcome considering Hamilton held on to the advantage for 2 or 3 laps, which is a strange situation. The FIA have said this year that it's up to the drivers and teams themselves to determine if they should give positions back. Pierre Gasly got caught out by this earlier this year, with the driver not handing a position back in Austin and subsequently getting a 5-second penalty. It doesn't really make sense to let the teams decide themselves and then potentially get a worse penalty later down the line. For me, the FIA has a responsibility to manage these sorts of situations, and they should be able to immediately make the decision to ask for the position to be handed back. I can't imagine any other sport where the referee is passive. But either way, there just needs to be consistency. You can't make one type of call in Austin and then not make the same type of call in Abu Dhabi. Of course, as ever with the FIA, there were problems with track limits. It feels like we've been talking about these issues for years, but even in qualifying there were some seriously dubious calls for track limits at the final corner, with many drivers arguably over the limit but not getting penalised for it. Again, the FIA have fixed cameras at these positions to make these decisions, but they didn't seem to be checked on this occasion. I have to say then that the FIA are deserving of a red box for this weekend. They failed to show consistency this season, which is perhaps something that can be expected given the complete overhaul of personnel this year. There's a lot for them to improve going into next year and beyond. Vettel leaves in style. I can't not recognise Sebastian Vettel's final race in Formula 1, especially because he was so strong throughout the first stint. Vettel spent a lot of time between 2 Alpine cars, and he did so well to keep in the fight with Ocon despite being in an Aston Martin that was probably at a disadvantage in terms of outright pace. I thought the battles Vettel had in those opening stages showed just how great the track changes in Abu Dhabi have been, as they were able to battle throughout the majority of the middle sector. Not only this, but Vettel even made an overtake stick on the Red Bull of Sergio Perez after he'd stopped, as the Mexican driver outbraked himself at the end of the main straight, and the Aston Martin driver took advantage of that to get back past him through the next DRS zone. It was these kinds of battles that were almost unnecessary for the 4-time champion, but I got the feeling that he was just leaving everything out there in his final Grand Prix. Vettel didn't let Alonso get through, which frustrated his rival throughout the opening laps, and it was great to watch. But with Vettel going for the one-stop strategy, and perhaps being one of the only drivers in the midfield to make that method work, soon his pace started to drop. He was getting beaten by so many drivers as he plummeted down the order throughout the pit stops, and he fell all the way down to 19th position. It was a shame as Vettel was showing a huge amount of promise in this race and was defending so well throughout those opening laps, but in the end it wasn't enough, and despite making moves on his fresh tyres, he was still a long way behind Esteban Ocon at the checkered flag, the driver that he was fighting throughout the early stages. Vettel's one-stop strategy ultimately meant that he finished further down the order than he might have done with a 2-stop race. He even lost out to his teammate, who he let by in the closing stages, but he still kept it interesting with a brilliant battle to the checkered flag with Daniel Ricciardo, another driver that's leaving the sport this year. For me, Vettel's career has been awesome to witness. In the last few years, he's become a driver that's fighting for so much more than just F1 points. His causes outside the sport have arguably become more important to him, and that's something that I think we can all admire. So for a brilliant race where he was fighting right to the end, it's got to be a green box for Seb. He supported the Aston Martin team so much this year and they've developed so well despite the cost limits. There's no doubt in my mind that the performance improvements can be attributed to Vettel's feedback and support for the team. So it's a shame for them to be losing such a talented and experienced driver. I think he'll be missed. The one thing that was a shame with Vettel's final race is the fact that both Alonso and Hamilton retired, which means we couldn't repeat the final race donuts that we saw with those three drivers just a few years ago. Honourable Mentions. Lando Norris is definitely deserving of an honourable mention today. He ended up 6th in the race and was always in that best of the rest spot this evening in Abu Dhabi, with the fastest lap point to go with it. He was the only driver outside the top teams to score more than 100 points this season, and he just seemed to be untouchable this year in that McLaren. And in this race, it was no different. So there we have it, the close of the 2022 season. But there's lots more to come from behind the drive in the coming weeks. I'll be ranking the races and ranking the drivers in the next week, so make sure to subscribe to not miss out.